The general store door didn't slam shut on Rue. It just clicked. That soft final click of a latch catching was somehow worse than a slam. A slam meant anger. A click meant she simply didn't matter enough to warrant the effort. She stood on the wooden boardwalk of Harlan's Crossing, Montana, in the last grey hour before dark, and she counted what she had. One carpetbag, soaked through at the bottom where the seam had split, a wool coat missing 2 buttons, 43 cents, and the knowledge that the next town was 31 miles east through a mountain pass that the store clerk had described, with genuine disinterest, as impassable before May. It was the 14th of November. She had made it this far on a borrowed horse that had thrown her 6 miles back and trotted home the direction it came from. The mud on her skirt had dried to a stiff, dark crust that crackled when she moved. She could not feel her left ear. The street of Harlan's Crossing was 3 buildings, a water trough, and a lot of ambition. A general store, a livery that appeared to be held together by old paint and optimism, and a low, dark building at the far end with no sign, which either meant it was a saloon or a place where men went to quietly die. Either way, she wasn't going in. Rue pressed herself against the post at the edge of the boardwalk and thought, with a clarity she hadn't expected, that she might actually be finished. Not dying dramatically in the snow, arms outstretched, the way she'd read about in novels. Just quietly stopping, sitting down against this post and becoming part of the landscape by morning. That was when the wagon came. It came down, out of the North Trail, the 2 horses pulling it moving with the resigned, head-down patience of animals that had made this trip too many times to count. The man driving it was enormous, not tall in an elegant way. Enormous the way a lodgepole pine is enormous, dense and old and indifferent to weather. He wore a canvas duster, dark with rain, and a low-brimmed hat that had long since given up its original shape. The horses stopped in front of the general store without being told to. The man climbed down. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side in a way that looked like old injury, rather than new pain. He tied the reins to the post without looking at her. He went inside. He came back out 7 minutes later, carrying a burlap sack and a tin of something she couldn't see. He loaded them in the wagon bed with methodical efficiency. He tied down the canvas cover. He checked the horse's near rear shoe, decided something about it, and dropped the hoof. Then he turned and looked at her. He had a face like the side of a bluff, heavy jaw, a beard gone grey at the corners, deep-set eyes the color of creek water in November. He didn't look threatening. He didn't look kind. He looked kind. He looked like a man who had gotten very comfortable with the math of the wilderness, where things were either useful or they weren't. He looked at her soaked carpetbag, her cracked boots, the way she was holding her right arm around her ribs in the unconscious gesture of someone who'd taken a hard fall recently. "Store's closed," he said. His voice was rough in the way that meant it didn't get used much. "I know." Hers came out barely above a whisper. She hadn't spoken to anyone in 2 days, and her throat had apparently decided to quit. He looked back up the North Trail, then at the sky, doing some private calculation about weather and time and whatever men like this calculated. "You got somewhere to be?" The question landed so gently and so terribly that for a moment Rue couldn't answer. She had somewhere she was going. That was different. She'd been going to her cousin's place in Missoula, where she'd never been invited, but where she'd hoped proximity and desperation might count for something. But she had no somewhere to be. Nobody was waiting. Nobody had set a plate. "No," she said. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he walked to the back of the wagon and unlatched the tailgate. "Climb up," he said. "Road's rough. Hold on to the sideboards." She didn't ask where he was going. She didn't ask his name. She picked up her carpetbag and she climbed. The road north was not a road. It was a suggestion made by a creek bed, argued with by tree roots, and occasionally abandoned altogether. The wagon lurched and jolted. Rue sat wedged between a feed sack and a wooden crate that smelled strongly of pine tar, and she held onto the sideboards and did not let go. She watched the man's back. She was good at reading backs. She'd had years of practice reading the set of a man's shoulders for what was coming. This one was different. The tension, it wasn't coiled or waiting. It was just the tension of a man managing horses on a difficult trail in fading light. He wasn't thinking about her. She slipped her hand into her carpet bag and, found by feel, the short-handled skinning knife she'd bought at a pawn shop in Billings. It was the one smart thing she'd done in the last 3 months. She held it in her lap, inside the bag, and let the jolting road rattle her bones, and watched the trees close in on either side. It was fully dark when the trail opened into a clearing. The cabin sat back against the tree line, low and solid, built from logs that had gone grey with age. A stone chimney pushed a thin curl of smoke into the black sky. There was a small outbuilding to the left, a lean-to woodpile and a rough corral where 2 mules watched them arrive with the universal skepticism of mules. The man pulled the horses up. He climbed down, tied them, and opened the tailgate. "Mind the step," he said, and offered his hand. She didn't take it. She climbed down herself, stumbled on the last step, and caught the wagon wheel. He had already turned and was unhitching the horses, running his hands down their legs, checking each one before he led them into the small outbuilding. She could hear the sound of him moving around in there, the clink of buckles being hung, the low rip of hay being pulled from a net. Several minutes passed. He came back out, bolted the outbuilding, and walked to the cabin door. He opened it. "Come in," he said. "Or don't." She went in. The inside of the cabin was a single room that had been arranged by someone who didn't want to waste a single inch. A stone fireplace on the north wall with a cast-iron cooking grate. A heavy table, 2 chairs, both looked hand-built and were. A rope spring cot against the east wall under a shelf loaded with jars of preserved things. On the opposite wall, tools hung on iron pegs in a line so regular it looked almost military. A rain slicker, a coil of rope, a rifle on 2 wooden notches at head height, a box of shells on the shelf beneath it. A single oil lamp sat on the table. The man lit it with a match, struck on his thumbnail. The light showed her more of him. He was older than she'd first thought. Mid-40s, maybe. A scar ran from his left jawline into his beard, which meant it was old enough that the beard had long since grown over it. His hands were enormous, and so badly scarred across the knuckles that she couldn't tell what was old injury and what was just weather. He hung his duster on a peg. He didn't speak. He went to the fireplace, moved the banked coals with an iron poker, laid 2 birch logs in the grate, and coaxed the fire back up with the focused economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "Sit," he said, not unkindly, just as instruction. Rue sat in the chair nearest the fire and put her hands in her lap and waited. He pulled a cast-iron pot from a hook, packed snow from a bucket by the door, set it on the grate to melt. He went to the shelf and came back with a cloth-wrapped bundle she couldn't identify and a handful of dried herbs that went into the pot without ceremony. Then a jar of something, then dried strips of meat, the dark reddish-brown of venison. He had not asked her what she wanted. He had not asked her anything. "What's your name?" he said from across the room. It wasn't quite a question. "Rue," she said. He moved the pot slightly on the grate. "Wren." She waited for more. There was no more. His name was Wren, and that was apparently the total of what needed saying. The fire grew. The cabin warmed. The smell of the soup became something astonishing. The deep, dark smell of venison fat rendering into broth. The sharp sweetness of the dried herbs. The faint mineral smell of the melted snow. Rue's body betrayed her utterly. Her stomach contracted so hard she pressed her fist against it through her coat. Wren filled 2 tin bowls and set one on the table in front of her with a wooden spoon. He took his own bowl to the chair opposite, sat, and ate. She picked up the spoon. The soup was simple beyond description. Broth, meat, a few dried root vegetables that had softened in the heat. That was all. It was the single best thing she had put in her mouth in 5 months, and it hit her empty stomach like a warm hand, placed flat against her chest, pressing gently in. She did not try to be polite. She ate the bowl completely, then set it down, and then sat with her eyes closed for a moment because she needed to. When she opened them, Ren was watching her. Not in the way that she dreaded being watched. He was looking at her the way you look at something you're trying to understand, something that has appeared in the world and needs to be correctly categorized. "When did you last eat?" he said. "Yesterday," she said. "Before that," she paused, "I found some roe ships." He looked at her for another moment, then stood, refilled her bowl without asking, and set it back in front of her. She ate that one, too. That night, Ren gave her the cot. He rolled out a canvas bedroll near the fire, settled into it without discussion or resentment, and was apparently asleep within 3 minutes. Rue lay in the cot under a heavy wool blanket and a buffalo hide that smelled strongly of animal and age, and she stared at the ceiling, and she listened. She was listening for the shift in his breathing that meant he was awake. For the sound of movement. For anything that would confirm what every instinct that had kept her alive for the past 5 months was screaming, which was that this was a trap of some kind, that no one did what this man had done for no reason. His breathing stayed even. The fire settled. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees with a sound like distant water. She was still awake when the first light came grey through the oilcloth window. But somewhere in the night, the knife in her hand had slipped down through her loosened fingers, and the tension had gone out of her jaw, and she had slept without knowing she was doing it. The cold came for her on the second day. She had felt it building in her chest all through that first night. But she'd told herself it was just the wet and the chill of the ride, and it would pass. By mid-morning of the second day, it had settled into her lungs with the particular heaviness that meant it wasn't passing anywhere. A dry cough that raked up from somewhere deep, a fever that arrived so fast it felt like a curtain dropping. She was standing at the table, attempting to wash the breakfast bowls, when her legs went out, not gradually, just gone. She caught the table edge with both hands and held on. Ren was there before she'd fully processed what was happening. He didn't grab at her. He just put one large hand flat on her back, steadying, and waited until she'd got her feet under her again. Then he pressed the back of his wrist against her forehead, a blunt, clinical gesture. His skin was so cool against her burning face that she nearly leaned into it. "Fever," he said, the same way he said everything, like a man taking inventory. "I'm fine," she straightened. "I'll rest a minute." He looked at her. "The cot," he said. Not a suggestion. She wanted to argue. She was extraordinarily tired of being a problem for people to manage. But the cabin was tilting slightly, and the effort of arguing seemed greater than she currently had available. She went to the cot. He came with a tin mug that contained something that smelled medicinal and bitter and tasted exactly as bad as it smelled. She asked what it was. He said willow bark and yarrow, and held the cup until she'd drunk all of it. He pulled the buffalo hide up over her shoulders and moved away. She slept. She dreamed in fragments. The face of her employer, the thin banker's clerk in Billings, with the small eyes and the hard opinions about what women in his office ought to be willing to do to keep their position. The sound of her own voice, louder than she'd planned, telling him exactly what she thought of his opinions, and watching all the color drain out of his face and refill with a different color. The door of the boarding house where she'd been living locked against her that same evening with her wages already docked, and her trunk on the porch in the rain. She'd had a plan. Her cousin in Missoula, a letter she'd sent 2 months ago that had not yet received a reply, which she had chosen to interpret as postal delay rather than what it probably was. In the dream, the letter came back unopened, and she tried to read her own handwriting through the envelope. She woke to darkness and the orange glow of the banked fire, and for a terrible, vertiginous moment she did not know where she was. "Easy." The voice came from across the room, quiet and steady, and something in it reached past her panic and held it. Ren was sitting at the table. He had the oil lamp lit low, and he was working on something with his hands, a piece of leather harness, she could see now. An awl and heavy thread. He had not been sleeping. She didn't know how long she'd been out. "What time is it?" she rasped. "Late." He didn't look up from the harness. "Drink some water." There was a cup on the crate beside the cot. She drank. The water was cold and real and good. "You don't have to stay up," she said. He pulled the thread through the leather. "I'm not sleepy. You've been sitting there for a while. How do you know?" "The lamp," she said. "The oil levels dropped about a third from when I fell asleep." He did look up at that. She couldn't read his expression in the low light. He went back to the harness. "Fever's lower," he said. "Not gone. Drink the rest of the water." She drank the rest of the water. She lay back down. Outside there was no wind, and the silence was complete and total in a way that she had never heard in any city she'd lived in. The silence had a texture to it, a depth. "Wren," she said, "why do you live up here?" A long pause. The awl punched through the leather. "Tried other ways," he said. "Didn't suit." "What ways?" "Army, cattle work, town." He pulled the thread through. "Towns are loud." "They are," she agreed. "People in them want something from you all the time." "Yes." She looked at the ceiling. "They do." The fire settled. He kept working. She didn't sleep this time, but she lay still, and the silence stopped feeling empty, and started feeling like something else. Like a room where someone had chosen to keep the furniture minimal, deliberately. Because some things are better without clutter. She was thinking about that when she finally drifted off again. And this time she didn't dream at all. The fever broke on the third morning. She knew it was breaking because she woke up drenched in sweat and cold and feeling more like herself than she had in days, in the specific, wrung-out way of someone just released from a grip. Wren fed her. Broth first, then bread when she held the broth down, then more substantive things as the day went on. He didn't hover, but he appeared with food at regular intervals, with the consistency of a man who had decided that feeding her was now one of his duties, and he was going to execute it properly. On the fourth day she got up. He didn't argue. He watched her make her slow way from the cot to the table, to the window, cataloguing. She suspected whether she was going to go back down. When she didn't, he handed her coffee and went outside to check the animals, and that was that. She was up. The cot was hers to be sick in, and the rest of the cabin was now available again. She found something to do. She straightened the shelf. She inventoried what he had in the way of provisions, not to judge them, just because her hands needed work, and her mind needed something to occupy it, besides the growing, low-grade dread of what happened when she was fully well. What happened when she was well was that there was no reason for her to still be here. Wren came back in at dusk. He stopped in the doorway looking at the shelf, which was now organized by category and size, instead of by whatever system he'd had before. He didn't say anything about it. He hung his coat and started the fire. "I organized your stores," she said. "I hope that's all right." He looked at them again. "Took you a while. I found you had 3 tins of salt pork tucked in different spots. You've also got a good amount of dried beans, and a jar of something in the back that I couldn't identify. Brown, crystallized. Don't think it's molasses. Honey," he said, "from a tree I found 2 years ago." She thought about him finding a bee tree in the high country and figuring out how to get the honey out and carry it home. She thought about what kind of patience that required. "You put it in the back of your shelf like a secret," she said. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted. She wasn't sure she'd call it a smile, but it was something. They ate in the usual quiet that she'd stopped being unnerved by. She'd started to understand that his silences weren't withholding. He wasn't a person who talked in order to fill space. He talked when he had something to say, and when he didn't, and the distinction was clean and consistent in a way she had never encountered in any other person she could remember. After supper she washed the bowls and he sharpened a knife, and the fire burned low, and the wind came back through the pines outside, and the cabin was warm. She put the bowls back on the shelf. She stood looking at the window, the black glass of it, her own dim reflection. "I need to figure out what to do," she said. He didn't ask her to explain. He kept the whetstone moving along the blade in that slow, circular rhythm. "The stage out of Harlan's Crossing comes through twice a month," she said. "I don't know the schedule. I don't know if I have enough money for a ticket." She stopped. "I don't actually know where I'd buy a ticket to." The whetstone stilled. She heard him set it on the table. She didn't turn from the window. "You got family somewhere," he said. It wasn't unkind. It was the tone of a man who was genuinely trying to understand the dimensions of the problem. "A cousin," she said. "Maybe. I sent a letter." She didn't write back. "Friends. I had friends who were friends when I had a position." She said it plainly, without bitterness. It was just a fact she'd finished being surprised by. "When I left the position, I left the friends." Silence. "What happened to the position?" he said. She turned then. He was looking at her, both hands, flat on the table, the knife laid to one side. She told him. Not the version she'd been crafting in her mind for respectable company, the careful, neutral version. The actual version. The clerk's name was Dennett, and he was not a large man in any respect. And he had made himself feel larger at other people's expense for so long that he'd stopped noticing he was doing it. She had told him no, firmly and clearly, and he had responded to this, the way small men with small authority have always responded to it. She told him about the boarding house, the trunk on the porch, the cousin's letter going unanswered, the horse she'd borrowed that had decided correctly that it would rather be somewhere else. She told him about the row ships in the ditch. When she finished, Wren was quiet for a long time. He looked at the table. Then he looked up. "Man who uses his position to corner a woman into something she doesn't want," he said slowly, "isn't a man who deserves the position." He paused. His jaw moved as though he was deciding whether to say the next thing, or much else. Rue looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He picked the knife back up. "Wasn't a compliment. Was just the truth." She almost smiled. "I know." The whetstone started again. She had thought it would make her feel better, saying it out loud to someone. She had expected it to feel like setting something down. Instead, it felt like something had been verified. Like she had been moving through fog for 5 months. And now, standing in this cabin, with its lamp burning low, and a man who called things what they were, and asked nothing from her, she could see the actual shape of what had happened. It was not a complicated shape. It was just a bad thing that had happened, because a man with a small nature had been given a small amount of power. That was all it was. It did not require her to keep shrinking herself. To fit the size of it, she went to the cot that night and slept 9 unbroken hours. The snow came at the end of the week. Real snow. Not the dusting that had come and gone, but the heavy, deliberate snow of a mountain winter committing itself. It came quietly in the night, and by morning had buried the clearing knee-deep, and the sky was the flat white of more coming. Wren went out, shoveled a path to the animals, came back in shedding snow, and looked at the sky. 3 days, he said. Maybe 4. Rue was learning to read what he left out. What he left out here was the part that said she could not go anywhere for 3 to 4 days, and neither could he, and they were going to have to occupy the same small room for that entire time. "All right," she said, and went to put the coffee on. They found their way through it. She cooked, which she did adequately and was improving. He worked on equipment, mended things, carved something small from a piece of birch wood that she didn't ask about because it seemed private. She read from the 3 books he had on the shelf, a surveyor's manual, a battered copy of Thoreau, and a guide to edible plants of the Northern Rockies that she found genuinely fascinating and said so. He looked at her over the top of the harness he was stitching. "You actually reading that?" "Camas root," she said. "I walked past what might have been a whole field of it the morning I fell off that horse, and I didn't know what I was looking at. Could have eaten for a week. I know that now." She turned a page. What's the difference between Camas and death Camas? He told her. He knew which plants could be eaten and which ones would stop your heart, and he explained it carefully. And she asked questions. And at some point the harness was laid aside, and he was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, explaining about mushrooms and which hollow logs to check in which season, and his voice, which was always low, had gone even quieter in a way that she realized was not discomfort. He liked this. Being asked questions he actually knew the answers to. She filed that away. On the third day of the snow she burned the bread. She pulled it off the coals too late, the bottom gone black, and stood looking at it, with her jaw clenched, because she was tired of making mistakes in front of him. "Leave it," Wren said. He was at the table. He didn't look up. "It's burnt? Scrape the bottom. It'll eat fine. It won't taste fine." "No." He looked up. "But it'll do." She scraped the bottom of the bread. She cut it in thick slices and put it on the plates. She sat across from him. She took a bite of the burnt bread, and it tasted exactly like burnt bread. "It tastes terrible," she said. "Yes," he agreed, and ate it without complaint. She laughed. It came out of her before she knew it was coming, a short, startled sound that she hadn't heard from herself. In so long it felt like something rediscovered in a drawer. Wren looked at her with an expression she was getting better at reading. He was not laughing. But he was close to something adjacent to it. She ate the rest of the bread. It tasted terrible. The coffee was good. The fire was good. Outside, the snow came down in the patient, indifferent way that snow comes down when it has all the time in the world. The snow stopped. The sky cleared. The sun returned and laid itself out over the mountain with the extravagance of a season change, turning the snowpack brilliant and the air so sharp and clean it felt like something scrubbed. Rue stood at the window, watching it, and felt the dread settle back in like an old familiar. The road would clear. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. And she still did not know where she was going. She heard Wren behind her, moving around the cabin, doing the morning things. She heard the small sounds that over the past 2 weeks had become so familiar. They'd stopped registering. The particular sound of his boots on the floorboards, the way he set the coffee pot down. She heard him stop. "Trail will clear in a few days," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She kept her eyes on the white brightness of the snow. "Stage comes through Harlan's Crossing on the 1st and the 15th, he said. "I can take you down. Get there before dark." She nodded. She heard him move again, the sound of his coat being lifted from the peg. "Rue." She turned. He was standing with his coat in his hands, not wearing it, just holding it. He was looking at her with those creek-water eyes that she'd stopped being able to look away from, without feeling like she was leaving something unfinished. "I've been up here 6 years, he said. He looked at the coat in his hands. He was a man who found this particular kind of talking difficult, and was doing it anyway, and that fact landed somewhere in her chest. "I know these mountains better than I know anything else. I know where the water runs good, and where the game is, and when the passes close." He stopped. He looked up. "I don't know much about people anymore, but I know you've been reading that plant book every night for 2 weeks, and you remembered everything I told you about the Camas route, and you scraped the burnt bread and ate it, without making it into a whole event." She didn't say anything. She waited. "This is hard country," Wren said. "I won't dress it up. Cold in the winter and dry in the summer, and the work doesn't stop either way." His voice was level, not performing anything, just accounting for the terms. "But it's mine, and it's honest. And I'd rather—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked like a man translating something from a language he didn't often speak. "I'd rather you know the offers here, if staying is something you wanted to consider." The morning light came through the oilcloth window and laid itself in long pale squares across the floor. The fire crackled. Outside, somewhere in the trees, a bird made one clear, brief sound. Rue looked at him. She looked at the coat in his hands, the way he was holding it like a man who'd asked a question, and was fully prepared to hear any answer. She thought about the stagecoach. The 1st and the 15th. The ticket she could maybe afford to somewhere she hadn't decided yet. The cousin who hadn't written back. She thought about Camas root and burnt bread, and 3 days of snow, and a man who sat up at night with a low lamp, and never once asked her what she was going to do for him in return. She crossed the room. She took the coat from his hands. She turned and hung it back on the peg. "Show me where the Camas field is," she said, "when the snow clears." Wren looked at the coat on the peg. The same thing moved at the corner of his mouth that had moved there once before, the thing that wasn't quite a smile, but was its close, quiet neighbor. "It's about 3 miles north," he said, "past the second ridge. You'll know it by the leaves. Then we'll go when the ground's soft enough." She turned back to the room, to the fire, the 2 chairs, the shelf she'd organized, the plant book on the table, with a dried grass blade marking her place. "Right now the coffee's going cold." He sat down. She sat down. Outside, the snow on the pine branches let go in sudden soft slides, one after another, the sound of the mountain shaking itself loose of winter, the slow, irreversible business of a season turning, and something with it, some tight-wound thing in both of them, releasing into the quiet, ordinary warmth of a shared morning. The coffee going cold because neither of them reached for it quite yet.